Hi, I'm Loren Kelton, and I'm very, very excited to be here for the Reel to Reel Film Festival. My presentation with you today is called Story Deconstructed, the building blocks of effective storytelling. Now, every story, no matter how it's told, needs to have a handful of critical elements. What are they? Well, some of them include your plot. What is your story about? What happens from scene to scene? You need to have characters. Who are your main characters? Are they protagonists who are driving your story forward? Is it about you? Is it autobiographical? Is it biographical and it's about somebody else? Once you've determined that, are you going to have any antagonists, people that are going to confront those main characters and challenge the journey that they're on? Then we want to look at the obstacles. What are they up against? Are these obstacles internal or are they external? What's being placed in your character's way that's making it difficult for them to achieve the goal that they're after? Then we want to look at the conflicts. This is the juicy meat and potatoey stuff. What conflicts, internal psychological conflicts, external conflicts, are they up against? Are these conflicts formidable enough to want to take your audience along for the ride? Then, what's the resolution? After we've reached some kind of climax in your story, we need to know, how does it get resolved? Does your protagonist reach the promised land? Or don't they? And then finally, what are the key learnings? What is your audience going to take away? If it's a commercial, theatrical audience, their expectations may be one thing. If it's an audience reading your book, your short story, your blog, your vlog, your YouTube channel, they may have different expectations. But regardless, there has to be some resolution in your story in order for there to be a payoff for the investment of time that your audience has made. And then finally, the key learnings. What is your audience learning? What are they taking away from the story that you've just taken them on? That could be a corporate key learning. It could be a commercial key learning. It could be an artistic key learning. But regardless, when we talk about effective storytelling, there has to be something in it for the audience to think about, ruminate about, or perhaps even apply back in their own lives. Now, before we can talk about the building blocks of great storytelling, we have to ask the question, do you even have a story to tell in the first place? Well, I've got 8 questions that if you answer them effectively, the chances are you have a great story to tell. So what are these 8 questions? Well, strap yourselves in and let's get started. So, do you indeed have a story to tell? Because before we can talk about the building blocks of story, we have to find out if there actually is a fleshed out story in your hands. It's never a good idea to assume that you have a story to tell, or at least one that will resonate with your audience if you haven't inspected all of its component parts. But if, however, you can answer the following questions in a clear, concise, convincing way, then the chances are pretty darn good that you have a potentially powerful story to tell. Now, keep in mind that an idea in and of itself is not a story. So with that in mind, think about these 8 points. Number 1, what is the title and the length of your story? Does the title capture the essence of your message? Have you allocated the proper amount of time to telling and conveying your story? Is your title short, succinct, and unambiguous? Does the title grab your attention? Now think about the books or novels or films that have caught your attention and ask yourself, does my story's title do the same? Second consideration, why does this story matter to you? In other words, what triggered your desire to tell this story in the first place? Are you prepared to be vulnerable? How has the story transformed you? And most importantly, how passionate are you about the subject matter? Because if your heart is not in it, you can't expect your audience's heart to be in it either, right? Third consideration, who is your main character, your hero, your protagonist? Is it you? In other words, is it autobiographical, your story? And does it demonstrate your principles, your values, your belief systems? Or is it about somebody else? In other words, it's biographical. Maybe it's a case study. Maybe it's a success by proxy story. Either way, you need to have a clear understanding of who your main character is and really, really understand their backstory and their history like the back of your hand. Fourth consideration, what does your protagonist, your hero, want? All characters exist in every story in order to achieve some outcome. Maybe they want peace of mind, or maybe they want to be understanding something in a different light, or they're seeking empathy, or they want improved health, or they're seeking riches, or they're seeking revenge. And if your story is a business environment type story, maybe it's about increasing sales or productivity, or perhaps they're searching for a roadmap to success, and your story can help guide them there. Regardless of what it is, you need to have absolute clarity about what it is that your main character desires. Fifth consideration, if you want to figure out if you actually have a story to tell, is to determine what happens if your main character doesn't get what they want or what they're after. What will it result in? Poor health, personal conflict, loss of relationships? Again, if this is a corporate environment type story, the consequences of not getting what they want might be a stagnant workplace, poor decision making, a restructuring, maybe a lack of innovation, reduced sales, opportunities, those kinds of things. Sixth consideration to find out, do I have a story here, is, and this is key to any great story, is to determine what are the obstacles and the conflicts that are standing in your protagonist's or your main character's way. Is it fear? Is it regret? Is it anxiety? Is it pain? Is it the antagonist? Maybe you got some bad guys in your story. Maybe there's emotional dilemmas. Maybe there's a moral or ethical problem that they have to contend with. Regardless of the type of story that you're telling, if there are no obstacles or conflicts, you don't really have a story to tell. Seventh consideration, when determining if you have the meat and potatoes in your story, is figuring out how your main characters are going to overcome those obstacles and those conflicts that have been put in front of them. Maybe they're external obstacles that stand in their way, or they can also be internal, mental, psychological obstacles that they have to contend with. Maybe they draw on deep friendships and relationships or physical strength. Maybe they implement new ideas or processes or programs to turn their lives around. Again, in a business environment, maybe they use your services that you offer as a coach or as a trainer or a speaker or a consultant. Again, your story cannot conclude without these obstacles being overcome. Your audience has to have a reason to join you on this journey. Now, the eighth and final consideration to help you figure out if you have indeed a story to tell is figuring out what's been resolved or improved at the end of your story. Has your main character's pain been reduced or eliminated? Has your protagonist gained any new insights into themselves or other people that lets them lead a more fulfilling life? In the business world, it might be about a client considering alternatives or opportunities for further dialogue or referral opportunities that have been generated as a result of your story. So if you can answer those 8 questions in the affirmative, then I can virtually guarantee you that you have a story to tell. Now, I'd like to take a minute to talk with you about the critical importance of perfecting your stage mechanics. Now, when I say stage mechanics, I'm talking about how your characters talk and how they move in their physical space. Now, this could be characters in your film, in your TV show, in your novel, or it could be you yourself on stage delivering a presentation. It doesn't matter. It's just that too many people leave this component of storytelling to chance, and they do it at their own peril. Now, in a nutshell, stage mechanics encompasses 6 key areas that I'd like to share with you. It includes movement, which is the physical positioning and location of the performer in their environment. Always give thought to how you can move your narrative forward through the physical positioning of your characters. It also includes timing, which is how you create anticipation. It's how you play with nonlinear time, and it deals with your rate of speech and how you pause. It includes inflection. Now, this is where you put the emphasis on specific words and how you create mood. It also includes intonation, which is the pitch and tone or the rise and fall of your voice and the voice of your characters. It includes self-talk, which is how you react to yourself and how you change your points of view as a character. And finally, stage mechanics includes expressions. This is your facial and body expressions and how they reflect your emotions, your state of mind, And again, this applies to characters in both your screenplay, your novel, or on the platform as a speaker. When you incorporate stage mechanics into your storytelling and your writing, you bring a third dimension of expression, of meaning, and of entertainment to your audience. So please do not give these elements short shrift as you go about crafting your stories. Now, I'd also like to briefly share the importance of establishing your story's point of view. By point of view, I simply mean the four major perspectives from which most stories are told. These include the first person, when we're talking about ourselves, like I and we, or our, us. The second person, which includes you and yours, or yours. And, we've got the third person omniscient, which is when a character has full knowledge of all the other characters and what's going on inside their head, often a narrator. And it often refers to people as, him or her or they, for example. And there's also third person limited, where you have a character or a narrator who has full knowledge, but only of one character. And you often hear it spoken as he or him or her or she, for example. Too many storytellers are not taking advantage of the different perspectives or points of view that they could to bring to their stories a greater depth and interest for the audience. And I would simply encourage you to ask yourself whether you or any of your characters could better serve the narrative by adopting different points of view. So just give that some thought. Now let's move on. In just a couple of minutes, I'm going to share my detailed checklist with you that will help you craft stories that fill in, I hope, a lot of the blanks that you'll need as you go through your own writing process. But before I do that, I just wanted to share a few random thoughts about the process of building stories in general. Once you've got the germ of an idea that you want to turn into a story, I'd suggest you build like a clothesline for your story ideas. It's where you can hang all the individual events that happen sequentially through your story. And it'll give you kind of a linear way of visualizing the sequence of events that you're building. And it'll help ensure that your character is always forward moving and that the things that happen to them make sense. Audiences hate when things don't make sense. Now, everything that happens in your story has to be a function that serves to either help or hinder your main character's journey towards their goal. If you have a scene that does not accomplish that goal, you got to get rid of it. Now, one of my favorite writers, perhaps one of yours as well, is Aaron Sorkin. And he always talks about intentions and obstacles. What is your character's intention? In other words, what does he want to accomplish? Where does he want to go? What does he want to achieve? And what are the obstacles standing in the way? Now, that's a refrain that you're going to hear continuously because it's the bedrock of effective storytelling. And I've had to learn that lesson the hard way many times. So if all you do as you develop your story is ask yourself, what is it that my main character, why does he want it? What's going to happen if he doesn't get it? And what are the obstacles keeping him from getting there? Then I can assure you that you're well on your way to developing a potentially classic story. And you'll hear me repeat those themes as well throughout this presentation. And there's a reason for that. Another concept that I talk a lot about is empathy. Because in storytelling, empathy springs from conflict. And conflict is key. No conflict, no story. As you write your story, maybe you want to show your main character being, I don't know, for example, a victim of some undeserved misfortune. You may want to put them in jeopardy. Why? Because we empathize with people that we worry about, that we care about, that we're invested in. Now, you can make them good and kind-hearted so that what they confront is seen as even more harsh. You can make your character funny. You can make them powerful by giving them a skill that we, as the audience, might admire or aspire to, or that we can latch on to. You got to keep in mind that the audience wants to understand the fear that they feel vicariously on behalf of your character. Now, one of the best ways that you can achieve this outcome is to have a strong story opening. I always like to suggest that the opening of your story be your main character living their everyday, normal life existence before anything exceptional or extraordinary happens to them. See, that way they can identify with the character's existence and relate it to their own world. Then you can introduce the crisis, the thing that happens, the inciting incident, as I like to call it, that forces your main character out of their current state and into a situation that they have to solve, where there's some major problem at stake and they have to dig deep. We then get to watch as your character pursues their goal by choosing specific steps that are going to lead to some significant change in their current reality. That's what we want. We want that arc. Now, it's those pursuits that trigger the conflicts that they run into and the obstacles that they have to overcome. We, the audience, who you're writing for, we get to watch as your character has to go and find the resources necessary to overcome and surmount those obstacles. That's the nail-biting stuff. So all of this leads to the climax, which is when your main character actually achieves that goal, although it may be a different goal than the one that they started with, right? And after that, you get to show us, as the writer, the denouement, the ending, the aftermath, and what their new reality looks like now that they're on the other side. And how are they now living? We get to see how the voyage of discovery changed their life and how it contrasts with how we initially saw them. That's the excitement. That's character development. Now, this is where the audience can identify with the journey and decide for themselves if the stakes were high enough to justify all the conflict and obstacles that they witnessed, that you put in front of them. I'd also encourage you to remember that unless you're writing a diary, your story is probably intended for public consumption. You don't want your audience consuming your story and then telling themselves when they get home or when they close the book that that's 2 hours of their life that they'll never get back. And though storytelling does have no hard and fast rules, it does have guidelines that have been proven over centuries. And so I encourage you to follow the rules before you decide to embark on breaking them. So to that end, this next part of my presentation is intended to provide you with some of the hardest lessons I've had to learn in my own writing journey, and I hope that you'll find some of these points helpful as you construct your own narrative with your own characters for your own audiences. I'd like to share my 30-point checklist with you to help you develop more powerful stories. And I'm going to use a mix of examples because many of you are filmmakers, others are speakers or presenters or keynoters, and you all tell stories in different contexts. But all storytelling shares many important principles. So let's get into them. First thing is you got to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. May sound pretty straightforward, but as a storyteller, I encourage you to respect the three-act story structure. After all, it's been around since the days of Aristotle. Over 2,500 years ago, he wrote The Poetics, which you can still find online, and it's where he lays out his ideas about dramatic theory. So with Act 1, you're establishing your main characters, the relationships, and the worlds that they live in. This is where the inciting incident takes place that triggers the rest of the story. This is where your plot gets rolling. And we want to know if the protagonists are going to reach their goal or get what they're looking for or not. And by the way, the word incite comes from the Latin verb meaning to move into action. That takes us into Act 2 in your story, where you're developing the skills necessary, or your characters are, to overcome the conflicts that were presented in Act 1. This is where the protagonist develops a higher sense of self-awareness, and they're typically assisted in their journey by other people who support them. It could be gurus, friends, family, spiritual forces, books, colleagues, that kind of thing. That takes you into Act 3. This is where your climax takes place, where the tensions are brought to their highest point, resulting in a resolution that completes the journey of the main character. That's where there's a new sense of who you really are. And if you're able to share it with the audience, and hopefully they can experience it vicariously. This is also where the stage mechanics, which I'll talk a little bit more of after, come into play. The next thing is, have you built trust? Because it's next to impossible to build trust with someone in less than an hour in the real world. But in storytelling, all rational considerations are suspended. And that's where you have an in with your audience. Because the audience will give you the benefit of the doubt as long as your character is consistent throughout the journey. You know, just like in real life, trust is built through consistency of your words and actions. So ask yourself, does your character do what they say they're going to do? Do they keep their promises? Because remember that trust opens the door to empathy. Next, you got to practice what you preach. This is especially true for the keynoters or presenters out there, because nobody knows for sure if they're witnessing on the platform the real you or not. But they might just find out. So you want to make sure you're living up to the pre-conference or pre-event commitments that you've made. And in your storytelling, you want to do the same. Don't let people see two very different sides of you, like none of this Jekyll and Hyde stuff. So you want to look for inconsistencies in your story. If you stand for something, then make sure you stand for it throughout your story. Because inconsistencies are going to preclude your audience from getting on board with your message. And they're going to find the holes in it pretty quickly. The same goes for anecdotes and jokes and humor that might just contradict the image or the messaging that you're trying to build. So ask yourself, do your words, do your character's words match your or their actions? If it's an autobiography, or you're telling a story about yourself, are you acting as your character would act in real life? How do you want to be perceived once you step off the platform? And as per that overworn phrase, you don't get a second chance to make a first impression. Think about that and ask yourself, are you acting or are you performing? You want to make sure the real you is the same person in front of the curtain, in front of the camera, as it is backstage. Next, we want to look at making sure that your content is fresh and not derivative, because your audience can fact check you in real time, and they can smell a rat a mile away. So just simply tweaking someone else's words isn't going to cut it. You want to triple check that your story is your own, or if it's biographical, that it's true to its subject. There may not be anything new under the sun, but there's plenty of ways to put a new spin on pre-existing material. And also, please don't appropriate other people's material without attribution. Okay. Next is challenge your audience to take action. You want to embed calls to action into your story, especially if you're a presenter or keynoter. You want to ask hypothetical questions during your presentation. You want to ask, what would you do? Assume a new voice, a new perspective to drive your points home, like using the second person point of view. Be provocative where it's appropriate and challenge the status quo. Because, especially in the corporate world, they know that what gets measured tends to get done. Now you want to respect your time allocation and rehearse and rehearse and rehearse. You want to be prepared with 3 versions of your story. Again, this applies more to presenters or keynoters or people doing presentations to the public. You want a short, a medium, and a long version. Because if, for example, your best version requires 30 minutes, you want to have a 15 and a 45-minute version available in case you're running ahead or behind schedule. And knowing where you can edit without compromising your core message, now that's a skill that'll come in handy. It'll certainly endear you to event organizers. Next, you want to adhere to the promise of your title and subtitle. Your title and your subtitle, they must encapsulate your core ideas. You want to make it compelling and you want to make it clever. You want to make it pop. You want to avoid ambiguity. And don't be afraid to change it along the way. There's a lot of famous stories that have been told that changed their title. Strangers from Within became Lord of the Flies. The Return of the Shadow became Lord of the Rings. First Impressions became Pride and Prejudice. And All's Well That Ends Well became War and Peace, not just the Shakespeare one. And there's a handful of other examples. Including George Orwell. The Last Man in Europe became 1984. All of that to say, play with your titles, make sure they're specific and clear. Now, is your story emotionally gripping? Because this is the holy grail of storytelling. Your character's current state versus the changed state that you want them in is what creates the emotional resonance. Emotions cover comedy, they cover drama, and everything in between. This is where your performance, your stage mechanics, can play a huge role in imparting an emotional connection with your audience. And that's particularly important for the directors out there who are directing film and television. You know, you can use strategic pauses, vocal changes, volume, and intonation. These are all your closest friends to help you drive emotional resonance. You can't just deliver gripping emotion in monotone unless the subject matter itself is so over the top that it needs no external support. So examples of this would include documentary interviews of murderers who share their explicit details of their crimes without flinching or moving or raising an eyebrow. But that's more the exception than the rule. And some comedians also use monotone to great effect, like Stephen Wright, if you're familiar with his work. Now, for most of us, however, our physical presence can convey as much detail as our words. Use a rich vocabulary, and by rich I do not mean fancy. I mean descriptive, visual, cinematic, imaginative. Your words matter. Know the meaning of your words and use a rich vocabulary. Never dumb it down, but instead smarten it up. Don't go for the lowest common denominator, because honestly, you can't know what the denominator is for the audience that's watching your art. Your word choices should be reflective of how you actually talk, or how your characters talk. There's never been a great movie or novel created that was based on poor writing. And there's a lot of examples of directors who have made films where they've stopped production partway through because they realized that the story was not translating to the screen the way the words were anticipated. Like with Apocalypse Now, Martin Sheen replaced Harvey Keitel, or with Back to the Future, Michael Fox replaced Eric Stoltz. Not because they were poor actors, but because the narrative was better served with a different personality. Your story's got to be true, but not necessarily factual. Okay? The essence of your story must reflect what you or your characters went through, yes, but the road you take to get there, it can be paved with very imaginative stones. You can be selective with the elements you choose to share and those that you want to hide. Your primary objective is to convey your core message and ideas, but the canvas that you use to paint with can be in varied colors. So keep in mind that your story, to have the emotional power necessary to compel action or reaction, you need to heighten and dramatize what actually happened, i.e. the truth. So give thought to that. This one, again, is more for the presenters, but make data sexy, or at least emotional, seductive, alluring, sensual, inviting, stimulating, whatever word works best for you. People don't tend to get emotional about data points up on a slide. They often have facts and figures of their own that might contradict what you're saying. So if you're introducing data, be sure it has an emotionally compelling reason to be included in your story. Give numbers a life of their own and add some stage mechanics to make them less dry. You can say, now what these numbers mean or tell us is, and then bring some humanity to it. Now, how do you create empathy? Well, you got to share your fears and you got to share your flaws. And this goes for your characters. When you're vulnerable, your audiences, they're going to be eating out of your hand. You can get to vulnerable in steps, one breadcrumb at a time. You can create safety for yourself and the audience by sharing your lived experience and then building on those experiences until you've fully exposed your truth or your character's truth. You see, that's where empathy will flow more freely and where you'll enhance the chances that they're going to apply your teachings or retain your message, and at the very least, critically think about your story. Next, you want to create anticipation. Cliffhangers are great. They're a great way to keep your audience engaged and awake. You don't always have to tell your story from start to finish. You can stop at key points and come back in order to create tension or conflict, and then reflect back on what just happened. You can pause your story and come back to it. You can ask open-ended questions about what the character did or didn't do. You can make it non-linear and play with timelines. You can play with your story's point of view and move between the first person, the second person, you, and the third person, and get a variety of entertainment outcomes from that approach. Most people will want to know how the story ends, so keep them guessing just a little bit to reinforce your key messaging. Okay, if your protagonist was any of these things, would your audience react differently? You got to focus in on what the defining characteristic of your characters are. You got to leverage the attributes that can help propel your message with more emotional resonance. Is it possible that you're overlooking key traits in your characters, or in yourself, especially if it's an autobiographical story? Things that could unlock tremendous value for the audience. Think about that. It's not the writing, it's the rewriting. I'm sure many of you have seen variations of this. Many of you will know the prolific screenwriter, one of my favorites, William Goldman. He wrote such classics as Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, All the President's Men, Princess Bride, A Bridge Too Far, Misery, Indecent Proposal. The list goes on and on and on. He always did at least 15 drafts of a screenplay before it went into production. The rewrite is what allows you to refine the structure, get clarity on your characters, and make sure your plot is logical, sequential, progressive. It ensures that you've got formidable conflicts, and you can rehearse this stuff. The rewriting is the process of elimination and tightening. Nothing has ever come out of a first draft that was worthy of an Academy Award. Now, visualize your story like a movie. Close your eyes. Picture yourself or your characters delivering your story live. You'd be amazed at how quickly you can edit your work in real time just by picturing yourself taking, talking, and moving the action forward. Visualize how you want your audience to react to your story beats, to the tension, to the conflict. Are you even clear on how you want them to react? Do you want them to laugh at certain points, to be silent at other points? My suggestion is to always work backwards from the reaction that you want your audience to show or demonstrate to the words on your page. You're writing a blueprint for an intended outcome. Also, what do your stage mechanics look like as you tell your story? There's been some great, Carrie Fisher did a one-woman show, and Stephen Lang did a one-man show where they really put that into practice. They're worth a look. Now, get right into it. Most of the time, this is not a novel where you can get into the backstory of your characters and build a whole history before getting into the action. You want to get right into the action of your story. When you have limited time, jump right into the action. Get us into the thick of it quickly so that you can build your conflicts and obstacles early. That's what the audience is paying for. Only provide backstory if it's absolutely required, because that's going to leave more time for the audience to digest your story and to think about how they're going to apply your message or react to your message. Never gild the lily, a great expression I learned from Jodie Foster. Trying to improve on what has already been done excellently is not what you want to do. You want to go for excellence, but not perfection. Even the very best stories can be improved, but don't let perfection paralysis affect the gift of your story. And if you're convinced that what you have is the best that you can produce, don't agonize over it. Just do it. Coaches, story coaches, dialogue, they're great, but they have their biases, their tastes, their preferences, and those may not align with your truth. If it's beautiful, own it. Okay. Every choice must have a reason. If you can't justify why your characters are doing something or saying something, leave it out. If you can't justify why you used a certain word or phrase, change it. If it doesn't advance the narrative, cut it out. If you don't know why you're using a particular perspective, stop and figure it out. If you've made the same point multiple times in your story, ask yourself why. Subvert the familiar. Most audiences are already pretty jaded. They've seen and heard it all, and they're looking for something different. Win the audience's heart, and their minds will surely follow. Now, to do that, you got to give the unexpected. You got to put a twist on familiar themes. If you're going to do or say the familiar, then at least do it or say it in unfamiliar ways. Use metaphors creatively. Have the courage of your convictions and use it to deliver your story message. Now, if your story moves you, it'll move your audience. I mean, you've got to start with that premise, right? Otherwise, why bother? The chances are pretty good that if you, as the writer or its storyteller, are emotionally connected to your story, then you can convince your audience to be connected as well. You got to trust your gut instinct to know, and don't be dissuaded by critics, coaches, gurus, or self-help books. Be open to constructive criticism, yes, but don't depend on those elements that are core to your being. And yes, it is possible that you thought that your story was a gift to the masses, but that it falls flat and doesn't resonate. I mean, think about Heaven's Gate. Nobody goes into writing something for it not to be successful, but trust your instincts. Show, don't tell. Wherever possible, demonstrate the story element. Don't speak it. This is true of all your characters and antagonists. Speaking is a performing art, and your words should complement your actions. You can even use your physical movement to contradict your spoken word for dramatic effect. Consider the use of basic props and sound and imagery and lighting to personify your message. Not enough keynoters and presenters do that kind of thing. Next is turn your location into a character where it's appropriate. If your story takes place somewhere where the location creates a mood or the geography is integral to your story, do more than just say where it is. Paint vivid pictures that take us into the streets or buildings or landscapes that you're sharing with the audience in your story. Use your physical movement to show us what it felt like to be there, on top of the building, in the airplane, in the eye of the storm, in the desert, in the hot kitchen, wherever. Some films that have done this really well, think about Sin City, or Last Train to Babylon, or The French Connection, or A Passage to India. There's lots of examples where location was a character. Now, make your villain colorful. If your story has an antagonist, don't make them two-dimensional. Flesh them out and give them some life. This is going to help ensure that the conflicts and the obstacles that they face are more believable and visceral for the audience. If possible, give them some positive traits that we can empathize with. The best bad guys have empathy. Remember, your antagonists are there to support your main character's overall journey, right? By serving as an impediment to them getting to where they want to be. Now, become an excellent exaggerator. Don't confuse exaggeration with dishonesty. It simply means being larger than life, overemphasizing certain points, overstressing certain words or gestures for effect. Allow your audience to identify with your characters through empathy. It's a word we use a lot in storytelling, but it's very important. You've got to bring the audience along for the ride, and empathy is the easiest way to do that. The audience has to feel something for your characters, and how do they do that? Think about a famous character in a book or a film and ask yourself some of these kind of questions, like, why do I care about that character? What did they say or do that got me interested? What quirks and foibles do they have? What's particular about them? Are they self-deprecating? Do they show their vulnerabilities? What have they confided to the audience? How do they interact with others? Once your audience has a vicarious relationship established with your characters, good or bad, the rest is easy sailing. All right. The obstacles, can't emphasize this enough, the obstacles must be formidable. The audience has been through their own traumas, their own breakups, their own health crises, their own financial troubles, broken marriages, torn families. And so your story is up against a lot of competition, even though most of the audience isn't planning on sharing theirs with strangers, and you are. It's not the scope or the scale of your story that matters. What matters is creating an emotional bond with your audience. Great stories aren't great because of the status of the hero. I mean, think about Jean Valjean in Les Miserables, for example. They're great because of the way the hero, you or someone else, overcomes the obstacles in front of them. The best stories, they're about everyday people who find the courage to become more heroic through the course of their journey. And that's where you have the edge, because you can now craft that story using so many different tools in your creative toolbox. Now, your resolution must help to improve the lives of your audience. What do we mean by that? Your story should ultimately be client-centric or audience-centric. Your main character is supposed to have grown or changed from where they started to where they are now, right? And the journey should serve as a proxy for your audience. If your audience stepped into the shoes of your protagonist, of your main character, of your hero, would they be satisfied with the outcome that you wrote? Would they feel compelled to look at their situation in a different light? Because if the answer is yes, then your story has succeeded. Okay, a pet peeve of mine. You got to remove all the unnecessary words, and you got to avoid filler at all costs. Please promise me that you'll review your stories and remove all the adverbs. I know I'm going to get some bad comments for that, but unless you can justify why an adverb is being used, it's got to go. It's a lazy way to show emphasis where a standalone word would be much more powerful. And unnecessary words, they flood your story and dilute its impact. Lean and trim is always better. Shorter sentences are always more impactful than longer ones. Now, this is one of the most effective and surefire ways to improve your story writing. Now, the last slide. Your audience is smarter than you think. Never try to hoodwink your audience or pull the wool over their eyes. Like we said earlier, if you're derivative, then chances are good that someone's going to know and find out. And that's going to diminish your credibility. Certainly going to dilute the impact of your story. It's great to borrow from others and stand on their shoulders, yes, but give them credit and provide a new take on an existing learning or message. If you're in the corporate world, you want decision makers to think of you first, and you want them to feel you're the best when they need what you sell, and your story can be the single most effective reason why they reach out to you. So, with that said, I want to thank you for all of your great participation and comments and inquiries. I truly believe that by applying your talent, energy, discipline, and resilience, you're going to create powerful stories that are emotionally gripping and enjoyable for your audiences. Thank you so very much.